Well, it looks like it has started after all. Russia has urgently closed its borders with its northern neighbors, and from now on, a Russian citizen can only leave the country for Belarus or Asian countries, but not to Europe. 3 NATO countries are now off limits to Russians. At the same time, Germany is officially and urgently advising its citizens to leave Russia immediately. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, states directly that the Russian General Staff, on Vladimir Putin's orders, has already developed scenarios for a new offensive, and the most likely strike will be in the north, particularly in the Chernihiv region. Or the attack will take place specifically against NATO countries. Meanwhile, against this backdrop, Ukrainian Flamingo missiles are burning Iskander factories 1,500 kilometers from the front. And now almost half of Russia is within range of these excellent Ukrainian missiles. In this episode, we'll break all of this down for you. First, what does Putin's sudden border closure mean, and why is Europe talking about evacuating its people from all of Russia? Second, how exactly have Ukrainian long-range strikes trapped the Kremlin? Oil refineries are burning, a fuel crisis is flaring up. On the eve of the Russian State Duma elections, Vladimir Putin himself, according to Western intelligence, has become a hostage of his own defeat. Third, in which direction is Russia preparing to escalate? It's the axis toward Chernihiv, provocations against Poland and the Baltics, and of course the question about rumors of a new mobilization in Russia. And fourth, the most important one, can Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian territory disrupt Putin's plans, specifically regarding escalation? Or on the contrary, will they only push him to raise the stakes in this war? Anyway, as usual, let's break it all down together. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this episode. And don't forget to leave your comment under this video. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is also in this video's description.
That's why I'm not filming you. Diesel, gasoline, yes, in Yalta.
Gasoline here is sold for 600, 650 rubles, sometimes for 300, 350 or 400, it depends. But for tourists in Yalta, they sell it for 1,000 rubles.
How much would you sell this gasoline to Putin for?
I'd punch Putin in the mouth.
So, let's start with the news that basically gave this episode its name. Russia is closing its borders, which may indicate preparations for escalation. As of today, July 1st, the Russian government has temporarily suspended movement through railway checkpoints on the border with Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. The wording of the order is dry and moreover alarming. To temporarily suspend the movement of people, vehicles, goods, and cargo through railway checkpoints at certain sections of the state border. And here's what's important in this situation. The reasons for this decision are not being disclosed, and the duration of the restrictions is not specified. And the lack of explanations is itself a signal. Because if you're not preparing for anything, if you're not afraid of anything, then you wouldn't be closing the borders. Especially considering everything else that's going on, which I'll talk about later in this episode. This really looks like a step towards further isolation and escalation. On the other hand, I'll note right away that just a couple of days ago in the Murmansk region of the Russian Federation, they simply started blocking federal highways and checking all vehicles heading toward the regional capital. Moreover, at the entrance to the region, the Russian authorities cut off mobile communications and the internet. Security forces are thoroughly inspecting passenger cars, paying special attention to the contents of the trunks, and trucks are being searched with the help of service dogs. On Monday, the Murmansk operations headquarters confirmed these thorough inspections and advised drivers to allow for several extra hours in their travel time, because you'll have to wait in a huge line before the inspection to enter the Murmansk region. At the same time, on June 27, the authorities of the Murmansk region issued a warning. Residents of districts bordering Finland and Norway were warned about the activity of foreign sabotage and reconnaissance groups. However, for some reason, this message was soon deleted, and according to eyewitnesses, a counter-terrorist operation regime was quietly introduced in the region. And now the borders are also being closed. Well, in this situation, I think that total vehicle inspections and border closures are happening. This is fear of a repeat of the Ukrainian operation Pautina, during which drones hidden in trucks attacked Russian strategic military airfields, including the Olenia air base in that very Murmansk region. At that time last year, 4 Tu-95 nuclear bombers were hit at this facility. One military transport aircraft, an An-12, and one supersonic missile carrier, a Tu-22M3. But almost simultaneously with the closing of the borders, a second piece of news comes from Russia, and it's about how this situation is seen in Europe. The German Ministry of Foreign Affairs has tightened travel recommendations for Russia and urged its citizens to urgently leave this excuse for a country. Previously, the warning mainly concerned regions bordering Ukraine. But now it applies to the entire territory of unwashed Russia. The German agency has warned that the risk of drone attacks remains throughout the entire territory of Russia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Leningrad Oblast were noted by the agency. In recent months, they have increasingly become targets of massive drone raids. Despite the significant strengthening of the air defense system around Moscow, drone attacks and the falling of their debris have caused damage. In some cases, the damage was quite significant. Germany considers the most dangerous areas to be Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, Voronezh, Rostov regions, and Krasnodar Krai. And then the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a whole list of reasons why. Why in Russia it's become not just unsafe to live, but even just to be there. The German Foreign Ministry also warned about possible disruptions in air travel. Because of drone attacks, airports in Russia regularly face restrictions, which leads to delays and flight cancellations. The recommendations also mention fuel supply disruptions in certain regions of Russia. Germans were also specifically warned about the risk of arbitrary detention and the limited possibilities for consular assistance. And I'd add, they also told the Germans that you live next to wild, unwashed Russians, so it's better for you to get out of there. Especially against the backdrop of Vladimir Putin's paranoid fear of sabotage, the Germans were still asked to leave. In response, the Europeans urged their citizens to leave Russia, so that probably these wild Russians could finally be cut off from the civilized world. But to understand why Germany suddenly started talking about drones across the entire territory of Russia, you need to look at what Ukraine is doing. And what it's doing is something strategic. It's turning the entire depth of Russia into a strike zone. The latest example is the night of July 1st, Ukrainian drones attacked Penza that night. The Research Institute of Physical Measurements of Roscosmos was hit. And this is not a random target, this is a consistent strategy to blind the Russian army. I'll explain what I mean a bit later. The institute in Penza produces sensors and measurement systems for rocket, space, and aviation equipment. According to Ukrainian military intelligence, it is this enterprise that supplies equipment for Su-34 and Su-57 fighter jets, as well as for Ko-101 and Ko-59 M2 cruise missiles, Iskander missile systems, Bulava, and Topol-M. And that same night there was another powerful strike, even deeper inside Russia. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, reported a strike on an oil refinery in Ufa. That's more than 1,300 kilometers from the front line. We're talking about an oil refining complex in the northern part of the city of Ufa. It's called Bashneft Ufa Neftekim. It has a capacity of 9 million tons per year, and there's also the Bashneft Ufa refinery. It processes about 7 million tons per year. It was also hit. Let me remind you, before this, the Ufa refineries were already attacked on June 25th. So the same plant was hit twice in 1 week. That's 1,300 kilometers from the border. And here's the philosophy behind these strikes. Zelensky put it very simply, quote, "Every day we carry out our plan of using Ukrainian long-range sanctions. It's fair. It's a response to everything Russia does against us. Russia must end its war. Let me remind you that not so long ago." Zelensky gave the order, first and foremost, to the security service of Ukraine to launch a 40-day operation of daily strikes against Russia, and now it is being carried out. Overall, the scale of last night was as follows. In just one night, Ukraine launched 179 drones at Russia. According to Russia's Ministry of Defense, these drones were flying over Astrakhan, Belgorod, Bryansk, Volgograd, Kaluga, Kursk, Oryol, Penza, Rostov, Saratov, Samara, Tver, and Ulyanovsk regions, Krasnodar and Stavropol territories, the Moscow region, and over the occupied Crimea. That means almost the entire map of the European part of Russia is under attack in one night. That's the scale.
And these are Flamingo missiles.
Subtitles created by Dima Torzok. Subtitles created by Dima Torzok.
Subtitles by Dima Torzok.
Subtitles created by Dima Torzok.
Subtitles by Dima Torzok. Subtitles created by Dima Torzok. But
You know, drones are drones, but the main star of recent days is the Ukrainian cruise missile Flamingo. On June 27, it made its debut against a high-profile target. On Saturday night, Volgograd was subjected to a missile attack. An industrial facility in the Krasnoktyabarsky district was damaged. And later it became known that the target was the Titan Barikadi defense plant, which produces launchers for the Iskander-M and Topol-M systems. What type of plant is this? Knowing that is key to evaluating the strike. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the enterprise is part of Roscosmos and produces self-propelled launchers for the Iskander-M tactical missile systems, autonomous launchers for the Topol-M, and artillery parts for the Emistar-S howitzers. So, once again, Ukraine is striking at the source of those very missiles that Russia uses to terrorize Ukrainian cities. And note this, they're striking again. They're striking an object connected to Roscosmos. Remember this moment? This is the second time I'm mentioning Roscosmos in this episode, and it's not for nothing. And today, Bloomberg gave an excellent description of the episodes involving the Flamingo missile strikes. Here's a quote. The scale and geographic reach of Ukrainian attacks demonstrate how the country's long-range strike capabilities have evolved. Previously, Ukraine could only strike neighboring regions. But this year, in regions where more than 70% of Russia's population lives, an alert has been declared at least once, including the Omsk region in western Siberia, which is almost 3,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And the key to this breakthrough is precisely domestically produced Ukrainian missiles and drones. And here, Douglas Berry, an expert from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, explains. Flamingo offers the capability to strike deep into Russia with a large warhead. This is a significant evolution in the long-range strike campaign. According to him, the ability to strike Russia's critical infrastructure with drones and cruise missiles damages elements of Russia's military-industrial efforts and hits its economy. And it emphasizes to the Russian public that the war against Ukraine comes at a cost. The specifications are impressive because production of the Flamingo literally began just last year. The range is stated to be up to 3,000 kilometers. This potentially allows it to strike targets in most of the European part of Russia and theoretically beyond the Urals. By the way, there's an excellent animated episode about how the Flamingo missile works on my YouTube channel, and I recommend you watch it. I'll add a link to that video in this episode's description. And on this topic, Bloomberg writes, there are spectacular strikes. Those are the burning oil refineries, and there are quiet strikes, but perhaps much more important ones. The strike on the Dubna Space Communications Center on June 22 in the Moscow region became one of the reasons why Russia has recently launched massive missile strikes on Ukraine less frequently. And this is again a facility connected to Roscosmos. Experts claim that in recent days Russia has been unable to launch a wave of missile attacks on Ukraine because its space control and communication centers have been damaged. They can't prepare strikes, they can't launch the same Oreshnik system, and so on. Accordingly, if these communication centers are down, the missile operators also can't work. That is, Ukraine is not just destroying depots, oil refineries, and so on. Ukraine is methodically blinding and crippling Russia's missile program. From the factories where Iskanders are made to the centers that direct and coordinate these strikes. That's why I urged you to remember this important point about the Roscosmos facilities. So it's already obvious now that Ukraine is specifically targeting communications. Now let's talk about what the Ukrainian strikes are doing to Russia's rear areas. As Bloomberg writes, Russia should expect a wave of defaults, bankruptcies, non-payments, business closures, layoffs, and other signs of a systemic economic crisis. And the strikes on oil refining are described as a way to nullify Russia's main trump card. On a day-to-day level, we are already seeing signs of this crisis. Fuel is in short supply. Well, for example, Gazprom Neft, and Lukoil have started to limit gasoline sales even in Moscow and the Moscow region. In Crimea, there have been mass layoffs due to the gasoline shortage. And most importantly, Russia has started importing gasoline by sea from India. Once again, an oil superpower is buying gasoline from someone else and bringing it into its own territory. Why is this politically dangerous right now? Because elections are already on the horizon in Russia this September, and the fuel crisis is hitting Vladivostok for Vladimir Putin at the most sensitive moment. That's why he started loudly shouting about some often fabricated successes of the Russian army at the front. He is basically saying, listen, yes, don't pay attention to what's flying over Russia itself, don't pay attention to the fuel crisis, don't pay attention to the fact that the air defense isn't working and so on. You'd better pay attention to my stories about how the Russian army is breaking through the front line in all directions, how it's capturing more and more new territories. Just analyze Putin's speeches over the past 2 weeks. And in each of them, he talks about how the Russian army is breaking through the front line. And he says, well, yes, there are problems, of course, with fuel, but at least the Russian occupiers, I like this expression of his, he says, are pounding every day. Just imagine this. The president of a huge country, Vladimir Putin, talks just like some thug from a back alley. He says, our guys are pounding every day.
Well, the guys are pounding there every day. Every single day they're pounding.
I don't know, it's just, although, what am I surprised about? Trash is led by trash. If the people are trash, so is the leader. Oh, and remember how Vladimir Putin complained that Ukrainian strikes on Russia are meant to sow discord and fear among Russians and, most importantly, to make Russians doubt whether Russia's own actions are right. And today, the Institute for the Study of War is reporting something that definitely makes Vladimir Putin squirm in his seat. Amid Ukrainian strikes, Russians are increasingly searching the internet for information about when the war will end. And this number of search queries has reached a record high since the start of the full-scale invasion, specifically in the last 2 weeks. The Institute for the Study of War calculated that during the week from June 22 to June 28, the number of searches asking when the SVO will end reached 137,000. And the geography of these searches is, in essence, a verdict on the entire Kremlin policy, like, let's protect key cities, key capitals from the war. A significant portion of these searches were recorded in the Moscow and Leningrad regions, precisely those areas that the Kremlin had been actively covering with air defense systems. But for the most part, this did not protect them from Ukrainian long-range strikes. I want to draw your attention to the fact that Vladimir Putin just this Sunday in an interview said that he gave the order to produce, I emphasize, to produce more air defense systems, to develop more air defense systems in order to cover strategic facilities. Essentially, Putin admitted that these systems do not exist. They physically do not exist. There simply aren't enough of them. That's why Putin says, I have ordered to produce more, to develop more, so that maybe in the future we can cover what's left, for example, of the oil refining industry. And here is the direct conclusion of the Institute for the Study of War. Vladimir Putin tried to make sure that major cities would feel the consequences of the war less, but new data shows that Russian society is increasingly tired of this war because the Kremlin has failed to shield Russians from its consequences. And it seems that the psychological effect of Ukrainian drone and missile attacks has taken effect. By the way, the approval rating is also dropping according to a poll by the Kremlin-linked Public Opinion Foundation. Vladimir Putin's approval rating dropped by 5 percentage points from 74 to 69% shortly after the largest Ukrainian strike on the Moscow region. That was when the Kapotnya oil refinery burned. The level of trust in Putin has been steadily declining since February 2026, and the willingness for peace among Russians is now at an all-time high. According to the Kiev Institute of Conflictology and Russian Analysis, 81% of Russians are ready to support ending the war as soon as tomorrow. And this is the highest level since the beginning of the invasion, while the number of those who support fighting until victory has decreased from 13 to 9%. That means only 9% of unwashed Russians support the war until victory. But, and this is fundamentally important, Vladimir Putin himself answers no to this demand. In an interview on Sunday, he talked about Kiev's proposal to stop striking each other's territory and to limit military actions, but he made it clear that he disagrees because, in his words, this would give an advantage to the Ukrainian army. He called the main task, quote, the final liberation of Donbas and Novorossiya. Well, there you have it. That's basically the root of this deadlock. The Russian people, well, maybe they will want it someday, maybe they won't. The Russian economy is clearly already burning, and the man in the Kremlin is holding on to maximalist goals because he understands that after the war, his own elites will simply destroy him, and they'll ask, so, what was the whole point of this war anyway? Now to the most alarming part. In a situation where Vladimir Putin the rat is cornered, this rabid, foaming at the mouth rat tries to attack with its last strength. That's just biology. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, stated that the Russian General Staff, at the demand of this rat Vladimir Putin, has developed several scenarios for a new offensive in Ukraine. He described the most likely scenario as follows. The most probable option, and this is confirmed by several pieces of data, is an offensive action in the north from Russian territory, from the Bryansk region, not towards Kiev, but towards the Chernihiv region. That is, according to Syrsky, the enemy's logic is as follows. Thus, Russia is counting on stretching the front line and forcing Ukraine to redeploy forces from the main areas of the front where active fighting is currently taking place. So the goal is not so much to capture territory, but rather to stretch and weaken Ukrainian forces. The Belarusian option was also considered, but here the Kremlin failed. Russia considered the possibility of an operation from Belarusian territory. However, according to Syrsky, after recent events, the Republic is unlikely to agree to provide its territory as a staging ground for an attack again. Why? Because Alexander Lukashenko understands perfectly well that Ukrainian drones and missiles could wipe out his entire oil refining industry, factories, and energy sector in just one night, in a single night. He can clearly see what's happening in Russia. At the same time, Ukraine itself is making serious preparations in the north. In May, new fortifications and minefields were being built in Polesia, and in June, Syrsky announced the formation of new unmanned systems units specifically to cover the northern sector. The commander of the National Guard of Ukraine, Pivnenko, specified, a Russian invasion here would become possible if 70,000 troops are concentrated at the border, but the Ukrainian armed forces will not allow a repeat of the 2022 scenario. And here, as they say, the Belarusian knot comes up that we've discussed in previous episodes. Volodymyr Zelensky explained that it was necessary to strengthen the Chernihiv and Kiev sectors because Vladimir Putin increased pressure on Alexander Lukashenko to drag him deeper into the war. But it's important, as they say, not to get fixated on just one scenario. Escalation is being prepared not only against Ukraine. Western intelligence agencies are sounding the alarm about the threat to NATO's eastern flank. The head of Poland's foreign intelligence, Paweł Szota, said the following today, and I quote, Vladimir Putin is a hostage to his own defeat and will keep raising the stakes. According to him, Russia may continue the war against Ukraine for several more years and stage provocations against countries on NATO's eastern flank. He views Poland and the Baltic countries as obstacles to his imperial ambitions. And in this context, a separate issue is the rift between Poland and Ukraine, which the Kremlin is actively exploiting. Polish Minister and Special Services Coordinator Tomasz Semeniak warned that Russia might use the current tensions between Poland and Ukraine for information operations. He described Moscow's goal as follows: to undermine trust in the current Ukrainian government and in President Zelensky personally, and to escalate tensions in Polish-Ukrainian relations by influencing Ukrainians living in Poland. Now let's move on to the rumors about a new wave of mobilization in Russia. Let's put it this way. There is no direct decree on general mobilization, and most likely there won't be one. But there are indirect signs that the Kremlin is preparing for a very tough crackdown. Vladimir Putin warned the day before and signed a law to create a government database of absolutely all Russians' mobile phones. Muscovites are now being forced to apply for a passport only through the government messenger Max, which, by the way, can't even be downloaded on an iPhone. Plus, there's the sudden border closure in the north, which is how we started this episode. The point is that the Kremlin is tightening control over its population as much as possible. This includes digital registration of all mobile phones, control over issuing international passports, and closing border checkpoints. This is what Russians used to laugh at Ukrainians for, and now they're getting exactly the same thing. It's an infrastructure for controlling the population. Exactly what a state needs if it doesn't rule out a new wave of mobilization and wants to make sure, as they say, that all conscripts don't run away. And even if they try to run away, it will be very easy to track them. Well, it's very easy to track a mobile phone, and now they'll just force them to register it. And a few more important news items that highlight how seriously Ukraine and Europe are now preparing for any escalation by Vladimir Putin. Ukraine and Sweden have agreed on the delivery of 16 Saab Gripen E multi-role fighter jets. The deal is worth about $2.5 billion. And as you may remember, this is part of a major shift. Because at the end of October 2025, Ukraine and Sweden signed an agreement to purchase at least 100 Gripen E aircraft, and overall the deal could grow to as many as 150 of these planes. Separately, Sweden is transferring another 16 aircraft of the previous Gripen CD modification, which will enter service with Ukraine as early as the beginning of 2027. The second piece of news, Ukraine is changing the very rules of naval warfare. Ukraine has appealed to the UN International Maritime Organization, calling for the recognition of Russian shadow fleet vessels as legitimate military targets. They argue that illegal, let me emphasize, illegal transportation of sanctioned oil products directly finances Russian aggression, so such vessels cannot be considered ordinary civilian transport. And this is already working in practice. Over the past year, Ukraine has struck about a dozen vessels of Russia's shadow fleet. After the March attack on the tanker Arctic Metagas, not a single Russian LNG tanker has dared to go through the Mediterranean Sea again. Well, Moscow is now forced to send its shadow fleet tankers around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, which makes logistics much more expensive and much more complicated. So let's sum it up. Can Ukrainian long-range strikes disrupt Vladimir Putin's escalation? The honest answer is both yes and no at the same time. In the past few days, we've seen strikes on factories producing missile components. The strike on the Dubna Space Communications Center temporarily deprived Russia of the ability to launch massive missile attacks. The fuel crisis is hitting Russia's economy on the eve of the elections. Society is signaling that it either still doesn't understand what's happening or it's starting to get tired of this war. All this really limits the Kremlin's resources for a new major offensive. But on the other hand, and this is the whole paradox, these same strikes may not stop but rather push Vladimir Putin toward escalation, but don't jump to conclusions. For example, Polish intelligence stated that Vladimir Putin is a hostage to his own defeat and will raise the stakes to maintain the power that has begun to slip from the grasp of this little rat, Vladimir Putin. This is the heart of the trap Putin fell into. He can't retreat because he has publicly tied himself to the liberation of Donbass and Novorossiya and to the image of a victor. He can't win either because factories are burning on Russian territory, missiles and drones are flying every day and every night, and Russia is attacking everything it sees. And they're running out of gasoline, the economy is slowly heading for a crash, and so on. And the only option left, the only one Vladimir Putin knows, is to raise the stakes. That's why there are scenarios like an offensive on the Chernihiv region, provocations against Poland and the Baltics, closing borders, digital control over the population, and more. The harder the blows, the greater the temptation to escalate in order to prove strength. But this is very important. In the end, it is the dictator's final push that will lead to the ultimate collapse of the empire. History has seen such scenarios hundreds of times, and such scenarios of escalation have always led to the fall of the regime. So let this cornered rat, infected with rabies, go ahead and attempt one last escalation. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.